Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and to see all of you. My name is Mary Louise Kelly. I am the co-host of All Things Considered on NPR, and I'm here with this phenomenal panel who I'm about to introduce to talk about a title that was given to us before events of this past weekend, From Mining to Moscow, How Geopolitics Shape the Energy Transition. Needless to say, we have a little bit more to talk about than we knew as we were all departing and flying in, but let me introduce from the end Jason Bordoff, who is thinking deep thoughts on all of this from Columbia, from his post as co-founder and dean of the Columbia and Climate School. Welcome. We also have then Abby Wolf, Director of Critical Minerals Strategy at Securing America's Future Energy, and my busmate from the shuttle in from the airport. Welcome to you. And Andrew Kamau, the Director of the Energy Opportunity Lab at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and also bringing experience from your work in the government of Kenya, where you were the former Principal Secretary in the Ministry of Petroleum and Mining. So welcome to all of you. I'll kick us off by just noting a few extravagantly basic facts. The world is moving away from fossil fuels toward cleaner, greener energy. The demand for energy is going to go up, not down, as this happens and in the years to come. The transition is going to be chaotic. We're already seeing the messiness of it. And it's going to be fraught with all kinds of risk, but also opportunity. Among the framing questions that Aspen has asked us to consider as we frame the panel, they range from, does going electric mean buying lithium from Russia and Venezuela? What happens if the US takes carbon action and America's competitors don't? Where does the race to mine critical minerals from the ocean floor stand? So that gives you a sense of just how vast this topic is, and we are not going to solve all of these challenges in the next 50 minutes together, but what I hope to do is identify a few key threads so that those of you in the audience who may be already engaged in these issues at the level that people sitting up on stage with me are, or those of you who are recovering from the hot dog you just had at lunch and just coming brand new to all of this, so that we can all maybe take away something that helps us make sense of the headlines, which just keep coming, and helps us engage in our communities, because the unifying thread is this change is going to affect all of us. So let me kick us off there, and with the events of the weekend, which gives us a nice starting point to talk about the impact of war in Ukraine, the impact of Russia and how that war is changing the conversation around energy security. Jason, let me kick off with you, and welcome again.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation to be here. So Mary Louise encouraged us to be conversational, agree or disagree with each other.
Yeah.
So the first thing you said was the world's moving away from fossil fuels. And that's true other than the fact that oil demand this year will be at its highest level ever. Natural gas demand will be at its highest level ever. And coal use will be at its highest level ever. So we're not yet moving away from fossil fuels. And I think that relates to the topic of this session and to events of the weekend in Russia. Even before Russia invaded Ukraine, my often co-author Megan O'Sullivan and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about why, for all the talk of the collapse of petrostates decades from now, when the world hopefully moves very much away from fossil fuels, we could see feast before famine. We could see increased geopolitical leverage and influence because we depend on the largest oil and gas producers more, not less, particularly in a world where markets might be tight. We might be mismanaging the decline in investment in supply with declines in demand. And so things were actually quite ripe for Putin to try to weaponize energy, the way he cut off gas supplies. And we're seeing this weekend, again, sort of a lot of concern, and a small piece of it, very small, but what does that mean for, if anything, Russian oil supply? Because the world still very much depends on Russian oil supply, so much so that the sanction policy that has been put in place has been designed intentionally to exclude Russian oil, to do everything possible to make sure that we don't disrupt Russia's oil exports to the world because of what that would mean for high gasoline prices, for the global economy, and the economic and political fallout of that, as we see with the Biden administration. So that's one thing about the events of this weekend. The second is just a reminder again, if any was needed, which we've been reminded about since Russia first invaded Ukraine, and we had that helped to exacerbate an energy crisis that was already sort of underway, that in addition to the urgency of climate change, there are massive energy security benefits to reducing our dependence on hydrocarbons and fossil fuels. If Europe were less dependent on Russian gas for its heat, for its electricity, it would obviously be in a better position. And so I think that combined urgency of energy security, we have an opportunity now to combine with the urgency of decarbonization, and hopefully that can catalyze and mobilize action. As urgent as climate is, when countries struggle with energy security, they will jump through whatever hoops they have to jump through. Yeah. Andrew will talk about this in order to make sure we can meet energy demand. And then the last thing I'll say is, one of the things I'm quite worried about, among others, is what might happen with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine when Putin feels backed into a corner. That would be catastrophic if anything happened there accidentally or intentionally, not just for loss of life, for the water supply, for the contamination, but would also set back the cause of nuclear energy, 20 years, as Fukushima or 3 Mile Island did. And I think we need nuclear energy to decarbonize. We can come back to that.
Yeah, I suspect we all share that particular concern about what may happen at Zaporizhzhia. Abby, do you want to hop in on either the fact check, true or false? Are we moving away from fossil fuels? Or I'm curious what was going through your mind as events of this weekend were unfolding.
So I wouldn't say that I disagree with what Jason is saying, but I would just put an increased emphasis on the fact that Russia has been weaponizing its control over the oil and gas supply chains for the EU in particular. The EU also has been having these very large conversations about how to accelerate their transition toward a cleaner energy economy in order to wean themselves off of that Russian oil and gas. And what my organization focuses on specifically is making sure that as we're all sort of aiming toward these zero-emission targets, and it's not just coming top-down from governments, but also bottom-up from companies. You see automakers are making zero-emission vehicle commitments by 2035, that we aren't inadvertently miring ourselves in a different critical dependency. As we try to move away from Russian oil and gas, are we instead becoming way too vulnerable to Chinese Communist Party critical minerals and materials? And we can get into this a little bit later, Mary Louise. But the other thing with Russia about the clean energy transition is that they control a very large percentage of the nickel market. And nickel is a huge component in lithium-ion batteries needed for electric vehicles. Each NMC, nickel manganese cobalt battery, which is sort of the dominant chemistry today, has around 40 kilograms of nickel in it. And Russia produces around 10% of the world's nickel, and of that 10%, about 15 to 20% is actually the battery grade nickel that we need. So the higher grade nickel that is more valuable for batteries. So I would put that into context.
And that would never have crossed my mind as I was watching what was happening on the M4 highway headed toward Moscow this weekend. Andrew, where are you on this?
In Africa, it's a bit different because we're coming from a place before the whole Ukraine Russia conflict where you see high U.S. interest rates. So of course, all borrowings, local borrowings, go up. And you see a lot of countries that are having a debt distress in Africa. Now, when you compound that to a drought situation that has been going on due to climate change, where now you're talking about 4 years of failed rains, 80% of livestock in the Sahel decimated, back to coups and to political unrest, then you have the situation now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where most of the grain comes from, the import of grain.
Yeah.
That's not happening.
Yeah.
Fertilizer, again, that's not happening. So the cost of living discussion has gone up a lot. And of course, the world's attention has now focused towards Russia and to Ukraine. So there's not much going on in terms of, hey, what's happening in Africa? How are we able to deal with this? And this is after a long period of democratization. We had a period where we had a thing called silence the guns, and now we're back to conflict. Yeah? So young people are thinking, well, you know, there's nothing much for us in this game, and you hear people start talking about, you can't eat democracy. Why should we bother to go and vote? Why should we be involved in this experiment? Let's see what happens in a revolution. I don't have anything now. If we have a revolution, I may get something. If I don't, it doesn't really matter. I had nothing before that. And that puts back a lot of the stories on the energy transition to the back burner.
You said something to me when we were chatting before that gave me hope about some of this, and I want to hear you elaborate on it. You said it matters how we talk about this stuff, the words we use, and that among your goals is helping reframe the narrative from energy access to energy as opportunity, what that means for people in Africa and in other areas of the developing world. Talk about that.
Well, I think one of the key things that you find is there's a lot of talk about access, energy access. So, for example, when I was in the ministry, we moved from having 23% energy access in Kenya to 70% energy access in 8 years. It's unprecedented. Nobody else has ever done that. But the thing is, people had a light bulb in their house. They could charge their cell phone, but there was not much economic activity going on. So we gave them some kind of credit to their smart meter, but they weren't able to utilize the full credit in 1 year. So that's energy access. But how do you change that energy access to development? So one of the things that we've been looking at is, where is there diesel generation that's creating some employment, some industry? And you'd be surprised, we've just done a bit in Uganda, and we found out that out of, for example, maize miller. So maize mill is the stable crop, stable food in East Africa. And out of the 18,000 maize millers, 15,000 are using diesel. Yeah, use diesel generation. So that they're paying about $1.20 per kilowatt hour, US dollars. While you hear that the energy transition is around 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can imagine the cost of food. So what we should have done is gone and looked at where the load centers were. And when you ask them, why are you using diesel? Well, we're using diesel because the government never envisioned that kind of development. So we only got single-phase power instead of three-phase power. So the need for data-driven policy decisions is very important. And once that happens, and you can imagine, the installed diesel capacity in Africa is more than twice the entire grid capacity, standby diesel. So you're looking at, for example, Lagos alone, 12 gigawatts of standby diesel power. And that's all financed by local people, individuals, industries themselves. So they're not looking for foreign direct investment to come and invest in 12 gigawatts. And I think this is where the opportunity is. This is where the story needs to be told.
Yeah.
That if this is such the lowest hanging fruit there ever was, change that diesel to solar and battery. It can't get easier than that.
I want to keep us at kind of the high-level bird's eye view for another minute or two, and then we're going to get into some specifics. But staying with kind of where we are on this path, where we are on the track in terms of the transition. Jason, you said something that struck me, and you've written about this, how, the great power rivalry we see playing out in Europe right now, how giant geopolitical events are obviously impacting the energy transition, the transition to cleaner energy, but that the reverse is also true, that events are also going to be impacted by our degree of success or lack of in energy transition.
Yeah, and I think, again, just level setting where we are. I mean, it's extraordinary what is happening right now. We're seeing record amounts of capital being put into clean energy around the world, more than in fossil fuels last year. The ratio was 1 to 1.7, 1 for fossil fuels, 1.7 for clean energy. That needs to be 1 to 9 to get to our net zero goals by 2050. Historic policy actions like the Inflation Reduction Act. So we can, the pace of cost declines, of clean energy growth, all of that is exceeding many of our wildest hopes. And emissions are still going up. And this is sort of Andrew's point. It's just the reality of the scale of the global energy system. It's what happens when you take that many people around the world and give them not just the ability to charge a cell phone, but hopefully some meaningful amount of prosperity, industrialize, mechanize agriculture. The numbers are really, really big. And as complicated as that is, it is now being further complicated by geopolitics. Great power rivalry, tensions between the US and China, for example. We, as Abby will talk about, we're more concerns about whether we want all of our solar panels, all of our batteries, our electric cars, our minerals to come from China. If we take a number of steps to minimize that reliance, that may have security benefits. It could be cost inflationary for clean energy. The alternatives may be more expensive. And at the same time, the transition itself risks worsening some of that great power rivalry. We see trends of global fragmentation, deglobalization, and we saw the push for industrial policy. That's what the Inflation Reduction Act is, which got this over the finish line, this historic investment in clean energy, but trigger a trade backlash because of concerns among European partners and others that it is protectionist. And now we're going to use tools like carbon border adjustments to drive climate action in other countries that could then worsen those very trends of fragmentation or trade tensions. And the last one is after decades, I mean, there are many others, but one more is after decades of, as Andrew was talking about, convergence between rich and poor countries, we're in a period now of divergence. The gap between the wealthy and the poorest is going up, not down. Last year, $150 billion was spent on clean energy in emerging and developing economies. That should be $1 trillion by the end of this decade. And we can't even come up with the $100 billion we promised annually for developing countries who have a growing sense of resentment and hypocrisy about what they see in the wealthiest countries around the world and how Joe Biden is running to Europe to promise more US LNG supply when there's a crisis in Europe. And they're saying, what about us and what about our energy needs? Parts of the world that did not cause this problem, 2% of cumulative emissions come from Africa, nearly half from the US and Europe, are going to be worst impacted by climate change and don't always have the resources to cope with those impacts. So that tension, it really risks boiling over. It's a development story in Africa, but especially in the emerging economies, South Asia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. That's where the emissions growth is going to be enormous in the coming 10, 20 years. And we have no chance of meeting our climate goals if we don't deal with it. But the efforts to deal with it and to force countries to take faster action, I think there's really a risk of backlash and more tension there.
And maybe just to tie together what Jason and Andrew were talking about, the energy transition is actually going to be incredibly energy intensive. People, I mean, even talking about minerals recycling, that's incredibly energy intensive. You can think about, it takes about 4% of all the world's energy to smelt aluminum. And you need aluminum for lightweighting of electric vehicles to make sure that those batteries can maybe be smaller. So maybe you're mining less and disturbing less land. But, you know, the energy needed to smelt that aluminum into something that goes into clean energy technology is going to be, you know, the graph might look like this. It's one hand washes the other. You need to expend energy to make clean energy. And, you know, a lot of conversations are going around right now. What can the United States, the European Union, and some of these more economically developed countries do to help some of these countries across the global south that are going to be much larger players in this energy transition? As you move from a fossil fuel-based economy to a minerals-based economy, the countries that you're dealing with are incredibly different. And two of those key countries are the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Zambia, which have incredibly rich cobalt and copper deposits. And so when we talk about a just transition, how do you make sure that you're not just going back to old colonial era, you know, mentality of going to these countries, taking their minerals, and then having all of the value add someplace else in more robust, more economically developed countries? And so now we're having conversations, to Andrew's point, around how do you move DRC and some of these other countries, it's actually down down the value chain, because they exist very upstream in the mining sphere, so downstream to more minerals processing, which is, the many different steps that it takes to melt down or burn a rock from its rock status to the usable elements and compounds that you then make into foils, you make into alloys, you make into powders that go into these battery components. And that, again, is incredibly energy intensive, even too energy intensive in many instances to do in the United States. The reason why China so, and I will level set China is incredibly dominant in this midstream of the critical mineral supply chain. A lot of the conversation around critical minerals often focuses on where the mines are, but that's only one part of the problem. It's a thought eddy that we all get stuck in. It really is this part of transforming those materials into something you can actually use, and China controls anywhere from 60 to 100% of that process for all the battery materials. And partly it has to do with the fact that they have incredibly subsidized energy markets and they use a ton of coal to do it. And so in the US, we're trying to attract, companies to do that here, and they say, no, like our products are going to be going into clean energy technologies, and so we need a clean grid in order to make sure that these compounds going into that clean energy is actually clean. So they're gravitating towards places like Quebec, which has huge amounts of hydropower. But so, what are the different regionalization specialties within different parts of Central and Southern Africa, where we could be plugging into maybe hydropower and things like that to be moving them up the supply chain, to be making sure that they have enough energy and reliable energy to make it to that next step in the supply chain.
Stay with China for a second, because a couple of you have brought it up, and there's such a behemoth in this conversation. And it's counterintuitive. The transition to a cleaner energy supply is going to be so reliant on China because of their dominance of clean energy supply chains. It's hard for me to get my head around that, because we also talk about China as the place where the pollution, some days you don't want to leave your hotel room in Beijing or your apartment in Beijing, and where the industrial and factory development is well, I'll leave it to y'all to put out there kind of where we are in terms of their contributions to carbon emissions. But it seems so counterintuitive, and I'm trying to figure out where China fits into all of this going forward.
They're the most important player in everything. So when you look at where the coal plants are being built around the world, where the growth in emission, half the world's coal is used in China, and they're still building coal plants. So that's your point, Mary Louise. This year, or last year, 1 in 7 cars sold in the world was electric. That's pretty amazing, actually. I mean, and the International Energy Agency projects that'll be 1 in 4 in 5 years, could even be higher than that. They sometimes underestimate these things. Half of that is in China. So on solar, on electric vehicles, and on fossil fuels, it is just so big that they're pretty dominant in all of these. So,
yeah.
Can I
please
jump in here? I think it's a really odd thing to call some of this stuff green, to your point. Because, yeah, you got an electric car, but what's the carbon footprint of that battery? What's the carbon footprint of the solar cells? There should be a health warning.
And to your point, Abby, about disposing of or recycling of that battery eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. There should be a health warning saying, yes, it's sort of green, but this is the carbon footprint, and in order for you to go zero on your carbon footprint, you need to drive this car 20,000 miles a year. Then let's see if we can do it. Because the alternative is, like Abby was saying, let's add value in Congo, let's add value in Namibia, let's add value in South Africa, and then get them to move to green, to more green sources of power.
And I would just say that there are many studies that I'm happy to send around that do say that, the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle is less than an internal combustion engine vehicle, even when you factor in all of the energy intensity of minerals processing, of mining, and those sectors are, trying to abate. But as I said, it's a little bit of one hand washes the other. In order to get, the green energy that you're trying to achieve, you're going to have to probably expend a little more energy in the short term in order to get us to where we want to be. I'll leave it there.
I do want to say just one thing, which is that the dependence is not the same, and the energy security risks are not the same. And that was one of the findings that came out of a task force report that I'll give a shout out to the Aspen Institute, because my friend and frequent co-author Megan O'Sullivan and I co-chaired, and Abby was involved with, just released a few days ago, developing. We had a group of experts, met many times for a year and a half, spoke with indigenous tribal groups, visited mining sites in this country, and put together a set of recommendations with a critical mineral strategy for the United States. And one of the, I'm happy to talk more about it, the inputs to a finished good are different than the daily flow of energy itself. So this year we're also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo. I don't think that could quite happen again today the way it did 50 years ago, but the idea that if there were a disruption, geopolitically intentional or because of a hurricane or a storm or any other reason, to the daily flow of oil, that would affect our ability to get around today. It would affect your ability to drive your car, heat your home. If there's a disruption to lithium supply, if someone weaponizes exports and say we won't export, processed copper or nickel, that will have an impact on supply chains. It'll be inflationary. It'll make it harder to buy new solar panels or buy a new electric car, or it'll create challenges for the supply chain to build electric cars with shortfalls in batteries. It doesn't affect the daily functioning of the economy today, and it's not electricity. It's an input to a finished good. So these are quite different risks. We should think about them differently, and we need a little nuance in how we think about them. And that also means the toolkit of policy responses that we need is probably different than it is, say, when you build a strategic petroleum reserve in the 1970s in case you have a disruption in oil supply.
Andrew, you had a point.
Yeah, my point to what Jason is saying is, that's the thing that worries me. Because in the old days, somebody asked, how do you stop this colonial mentality for in Congo, in Zambia? My issue is that we're making the same mistakes we did with oil and gas. How OPEC got formed. OPEC got formed because the oil exporting countries felt that we're not getting a fair shake for the exports. So it's not unusual to think that lithium manufacturers, lithium mining countries will say, well, I don't think we're getting a good deal for our lithium, we need more money. We're not getting a good deal for our copper, we need more money for our copper. And this comes from the communities, because in the old days, if you're a mining house, all you needed to do was produce the mineral. Now you have to take care of social issues, you have to get your social license going together. Local communities now have access to the internet. They know where their copper is going. They know where their lithium is going. And I tell you, as having worked in the Ministry of Mining, local communities can be extremely difficult. If they decide you are not producing, you are not producing. They will call CNN or whoever. They will be there, and you will have hell.
So this prompts me, as I listen to all of you talk about the things we should be doing, the mistakes we need to avoid repeating, it's the kind of who's in charge? What is the enforcement mechanism? What is the regulation mechanism for any of this? You're talking about different countries with very different interests, very different resources, and at very different points on this path toward a transition, an energy transition. Is it every man for himself, every country for himself? Do we rely on the private sector? Because that's a little terrifying, just imagining, the oil companies policing this. How does it work?
I think we're all kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall, going no holds barred. Everyone's trying to do everything at once because we all have kind of competing goals. I think a couple countries are doing this because they're just trying to solve climate change. A couple countries are doing this because they see this as us being on the precipice of quite literally the next industrial revolution. I like to characterize this as our Jetsons moment. Anything with an on-off switch is going to require the critical minerals and materials that are required for an electric vehicle. An EV is just the leading indicator. And to Jason's point, it's not just about decarbonization. This is also about national security, and it's also about economic competitiveness. And in the United States specifically, and in other very auto-forward economies, Germany, Korea, Japan, this is an incredibly pivotal time for all of our economies. Because, and forgive me if people have heard me speak before, I use this example a lot, but people often say to me, Abby, who cares? China's going to cut off our supply of cobalt. To which I say, No, China's not going to cut off our supply of cobalt. In the United States, as I recently said, we do not process cobalt. We also do not make cathode active material or cathode, the guts of the battery that go into an electric vehicle. What China will say, whether nefariously or not, they will say, no, I'm sorry, Ford or GM, we, China, are the largest market for electric vehicles, so we cannot afford to send you electric vehicle batteries right now. But you know what we can do, US citizens? We'll just send you a car. And then what happens to the backbone of the US economy that contributes $1 trillion to our economy every year, makes up over 5% directly or indirectly to our GDP. We cannot allow the backbone of the US economy to be hollowed out as we make this transition, which is why no matter what your feelings are about climate change, you need to care about the deployment of electric vehicles, not only in a timely fashion, but also in a way that makes us less dependent on our strategic competitors that are inherently hostile to democracy. Because I think we can all agree that we like democratic institutions, we like democratic ideals. And Mary Louise and the whole panel, this is something that I've been thinking about more and more. Just, is this moment really proving to be an inflection point to further erode the concept of democracy as being able to solve big problems? Because you're asking who's in charge, and right now China's in charge, and they've been in charge for the last 3 decades. Let me tell you why. Because they have an autocratic government. They don't have Republicans and Democrats where you're doing whiplash between who believes in climate change and who doesn't, back and forth on policies. They charted a path, it's written in English too, that says that they are going to control the commanding heights of the clean energy economy that first started with their control of the rare earth element supply chain. Some of you may recall in 2010 and 11, they cut off the supply of rare earths to Japan over a diplomatic dispute over some islands in the China Sea. So how do we know they're not going to do that again? I don't think they will, but they might, but.
Yeah. All right, response from either of you, and then I have another question.
Yeah, I think I would maybe, there's a lot of important stuff in what Abby said. I don't know if I would go as far as to say they dominate the clean energy global economy. We need a lot of things for a clean energy economy. One is to make stuff cheaply. China plays that role in a lot of parts of the global supply chain, like the iPhones everyone has in their pocket and the clothing you buy every day, or a million other things. We also need innovation. We need the best universities, we need the best technology, we need well-functioning and well-trusted capital markets, we need the strength of the US dollar. We have a lot of assets in the US. We do need global governance. The International Energy Agency was born out of the energy crisis of the 1970s. We need international mechanisms for cooperation like that for new emerging forms of clean energy. We need it for climate negotiations, right? It doesn't matter where a ton of CO2 comes from, they all contribute equally. So that's why we need a UN climate process to try to work together. As I said before, the problem is we're doing this in a world that is increasingly fragmented, where we're more in a mode of competition than we are in cooperation. And I think that is making it harder and harder, along with what Abby was saying. People want to own the whole value chain. It's not just China. Indonesia has restricted nickel exports because they want to own the upstream part of the value chain. Countries, as my friend Julio here can tell us, who are able to make really cheap green hydrogen, don't just want to ship green hydrogen or green ammonia. They want to make the green steel there. There's no reason to ship it to Germany, because that's where the coal was cheap before. Like the new industrial revolution, you can own the whole value chain. That's what the Inflation Reduction Act is. We want to do that too. And all of that risks worsening these trends of cooperation and fragmentation, which we really need for energy security and to accelerate climate action and build confidence that we should all be taking measures to decarbonize faster.
Andrew, from an international perspective, what comes into your mind when I ask the question, who's in charge?
Well, the US and Europe would like to be in charge. They'd like us to believe that. But, on the ground, things are very different. I was telling Jason that some years back when we were on the Security Council, we had a meeting with the Secretary General, and he asked us, hey, are you guys getting a good deal from the Chinese? And we said, look, guys, the Chinese have a very simple process. They have state banks, policy banks, they have national companies. If they tell you it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And they don't have many stories about strings attached here and there, governance, all those things. If you go to Europe or you go to the US, the US government can only promise you that it's going to happen, and then they will hand you over to one of their big companies, who then spend the next 8 years with their bankers and their lawyers discussing. Now, if you have 2 5-year terms as the president, You don't have time 8 years to discuss with Bechtel and their lawyers where they're going to build on the infrastructure. You want your stuff done in 24 months so that you can show your people this is what's happening. I tell you, China is in charge right now.
I'm going to open it to y'all's questions in just a second, but I have one more, and I'll make this a lightning round. But a thought from each of you on when we all gather back here 10 years from now. I want to make this a little more personal and a little more individual. What changes might we notice in our lives, in the world, in our country? Understanding there's a whole range of scenarios and many unknowns in there, but energy security, geopolitics, it's so big and abstract. What's this actually going to look like and feel like from where any of us sit a decade from now?
You understand?
We are moving to a world where I think the playing field is shifting a little bit. You see, we haven't really talked too much about so-called middle powers, but they're pursuing a more non-aligned strategy. We're going to have sort of different regional blocks.
What are middle powers?
India. Saudi Arabia, Brazil,
India.
and Saudi is a good example, which is rethinking its relationship with the United States, not depending on it in quite the same way as it did before, not worried about upsetting the US on things like oil prices, and making sure it remains close to China and Russia. And so those shifting geopolitical, that shifting geopolitical alignment, I think, is really important in many respects, but including for energy. When you think of some of the geopolitical issues on the horizon that we're not really talking too much about yet, we're going to see huge growth in clean energy. I'm excited about that. I think we're going to see, I'll make two slightly, I don't want to say provocative, but we don't see this yet. But the level of social mobilization for the urgency of the climate crisis, when you look at what the impacts really are likely to be, and we're just starting to see them now, I think is something that's going to happen in a disruptive and nonlinear fashion. Ernest Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, he had this character named Mike, and Mike was asked how he went bankrupt. And he said 2 ways, gradually and then all of a sudden. And I think that's how social mobilization, people taking to the streets, is going to move forward to deal with climate change. So what I said before, we're having huge growth in clean energy and emissions are going up. That has to reach a breaking point, right? Unless we give up on our climate goals. And so I think that's how it's happened in the United States. Douglas Brinkley just wrote this fantastic 800-page book of the history of the US environmental movement. And you sort of see that through the 40s and 50s and 60s, and then these seminal moments like the Santa Barbara oil spill and the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, and then 1 out of every 10 Americans came into the streets in the first Earth Day and said, we can't live like this anymore. We can't have air we can't breathe and water we can't drink. Something has to change. So I think that is going to happen in the next decade. I don't know how and when, but also it's going to happen because we're failing to meet all of our climate goals. And that's going to bring a host of issues on the agenda, like solar geoengineering and adaptation that could have themselves huge geopolitical implications.
Okay. Quick thought from either of
that was not lightning
what's going to look
sorry.
different in 10 years?
I think that people in developed economies are going to reawaken to what it means to actually build something and what the trade-offs are going to be to achieve climate targets. We're talking about permitting, we're talking about reindustrialization, industrial policy. It's not all Amazon-like, People are so used to just ordering something and it appearing. People are going to understand what it takes, the inorganic chemistry involved in creating the things that you need.
Andrew.
I think in the next 10 years, well, that's when, 2033, the population of Africa will have grown by another maybe 700 million people. It's on the way to becoming the most populous continent in the world. 13 out of 20 of the largest cities in the world will be in Africa. They're not built yet. That's all construction. That's all jobs that need to be created. The people who are looking at this is India, the UAE, China, the European oil companies, due to pressure from their shareholders, will exit the oil industry to a certain extent. All that will happen is that these nations will buy those assets and continue to produce, and this is what's going to happen.
And will we all be arriving here in electric vehicles in 10 years?
Yes.
Yes.
You will, but we won't.
Meaning?
Yeah, because we can't afford as
Yeah.
it is now. We have huge problems in government trying to convince people to buy 6-year-old cars. Forget about 8-year-old cars, 6-year-old cars.
Yeah.
Now to move us to new vehicles, new electric vehicles without the subsidy.
Right.
That's not going to happen.
Right. Questions. I believe we have microphones. I see 2 over here. We'll take this lady in red, and then we'll go back to that young woman in blue. Hi.
Thank you. Hi, Joan Michelson, Electric Ladies podcast. Hi, Mary Louise.
Hi.
I just came from a huge conference in Paris with a big discussion of the corporate sector and the regulations and how the regulations across the globe, including the SEC ones coming down the pike, are transforming their supply chains and so really transforming their operations because of the need for the transparency and the accountability. And a big piece of it is minerals. So I'm curious about your opinion, now that I got their opinion, on how you think, and maybe you've sent some of the 14,000 comments to the SEC about this, but how you think these regulations can drive the transparency and the market for conflict minerals or reducing conflict minerals from your standpoint, and whether they'll make a difference.
Okay. Minerals. That's up your alley, Abby, if you want to take this.
Yeah, you like really teed that one up for
Yeah.
me. I have a report, a physical report. I've got 3 copies if anybody wants it. It's called Using Transparency to Create a Global Race to the Top to Secure Supply Chains, because we're dealing with an anti-competitive market actor in China, and so we are never going to be able to compete with them on cost to diversify the supply chains in the way that we need to make sure that the energy transition is clean and to make sure that it is secure. And so the only way that we will be able to compete is on values, and transparency is the way that we win with those. You know, high standards for the environment, high standards for labor, high standards for community engagement. And so the EU battery regulation is really at the forefront of making sure that this transpires by starting in 2026. Everybody who sells an electric vehicle within the European Union, there's going to be a digital identifier attached to that battery that says, you know, where it came from, the carbon emissions associated with it, and the recycled content requirement. There are pluses and minuses to that, and we can get into this later, but the United States, the IRA was sort of our very blunt tool on transparency, because we've got sourcing provisions for those clean vehicle tax credits. You have to source your minerals from a free trade agreement country or be recycled in North America. And so, you know, that is our very blunt tool on transparency, but they still don't quite know how they're going to track and trace that. But it's an excellent point.
Thank you. Yes, right here. Hi.
Hello, Brianna Woolman from the Bezos Scholar Program. In terms of domestic politics, how do you guys think that energy, in terms of energy transition or where we get our energy and resources from, is going to help shape political platforms for the presidential election next year? Sorry, Andrew, the question is kind of more U.S.
Thank you.
I don't know that climate and energy policy is going to play a very dominant role, as policy differences generally may not in the presidential election. My hope is that we're getting to a point when, kind of probably depends who the candidate frankly is on the Republican side of the aisle, but increasingly it's not a question of whether this is a problem, whether we need to solve it, it's how to solve it. It's the role of the market, the role of policy to help shape some of those market incentives, and also the suite of technologies that are available. We're not only talking about electric vehicles, we're only talking about renewables, but we are talking about carbon capture and low carbon fuels like hydrogen and ammonia, and nuclear energy, as I said before, I think is incredibly important. Technology, innovation, and there is actually a fair amount of support on both sides of the aisle for R&D and clean energy. Those budgets went up in both recent administrations. And when you cast a wide net on the technologies you're talking about, I don't want to be Pollyannish, but you can start to build some bipartisan agreement for the steps that we need to take.
If I can just follow on, because I thought it was an excellent question. You know, we live in a moment where issues that have been historically politicized and polarizing in our country remain and are more so. You know, abortion, gun rights, the list is long. Even things that have not been polarizing and partisan, things like vaccines, public health, have become incredibly toxic, as we all know. How Are you finding that shift in your field, in this world of energy security? Is it more partisan and divisive than it was 5 years ago?
I think it's incredibly bipartisan, and I think that the China issue is one of those reasons driving that bipartisanship. But also, and it's kind of funny, like when former President Trump was announcing his candidacy, was he in South Carolina on stage with the governor? And South Carolina, the Republican state, deep red state, that governor has instituted so many executive orders on behalf of the state to increase South Carolina's viability as a main EV destination. And it's all of these Republican states, actually, across the new battery belt in the South that are reaping the most benefits from a lot of the bipartisan infrastructure law grants, and certainly from the Inflation Reduction Act, the 45X production tax credits to stand up battery gigafactories. A lot of them are happening across ruby red states, which is making it increasingly more difficult for Republicans to campaign against this issue.
Interesting.
Although
Okay.
the bill was passed only with Democratic votes and the House Republicans just voted to repeal it. So, I mean, things are, we don't have as much bipartisan support for climate action at the speed we need.
Yeah. All right, we have room for one, maybe two more. Right side of the room, I want to bring you in if you have a question. Yes, ma'am, right here.
Thank you. Hi. Yeah, so you mentioned more mature countries as they mature their economies, global south or however we want to refer to them. As they grow, they'll become a greater contributor of greenhouse gases. And I wanted to know what the conversation looks like or what solutions are being explored between how the EU and the US will support in terms of capital resources that are renewable or anything.
Andrew, you want to take us a little into the
Yeah,
conversation?
yeah, I want to take this in because one of the things that has come up quite a lot is carbon markets. So what do those carbon markets look like? What do carbon credits look like? And I can tell you, unless we grow the markets, because right now you get $6 per ton of carbon dioxide. That's not going to cut it. You need to be at least $50, $60 because people know that, like Julio was saying, it's cheaper to stop the carbon dioxide before it goes in the atmosphere than after it's in the atmosphere. And we know it's costing you $300 per ton to take it out of the atmosphere, so why should you pay me $6? So you need to create better markets on this. And if we can do that, I think we will be long on the way to that.
Okay. One more. Let's make it a good one. Yes, sir, in the white shirt.
Uh-oh.
Hi, Julio Friedman, Carbon Direct. Thank you for the shout-outs.
I wasn't aiming for you, but you're in the conversation already. So
I got a nice shirt. It's cool. I have so many questions, but I'm going to ask one question for all three of you.
Oh.
I want to actually talk about the MENA region in terms of geopolitics, in terms of critical minerals, in terms of sub-Saharan Africa. What are we going to see coming out of the MENA region and how it affects all of those trends, Middle East and Northern Africa?
Thank you.
You want to start?
Yeah, let me start. I think what's going to happen is I feel that India is going to be the dominant factor in this whole thing. Because, for a long time we've heard, well, we can't invest in Africa because of this policy, that policy. And I can tell you recently, India just invested in the first public-private partnership transmission line in East Africa. So nothing's changed. The policies are the same. The regulations are the same. And they said, look, here is a place where most of the people don't have electricity. What a great way to get into it. This is the time, the ground floor. I think somebody was talking about IRR of 10%. You're talking about IRRs of 20%. Why wouldn't you want to invest there? So I think India is going to be the biggest player, followed by the sovereign wealth states of the Arab Gulf. They are coming in. I know when I was in the government, we had discussions with the Abu Dhabi Wealth Fund. They're looking at putting, something like 10 gigawatts of renewable energy there. They understand, because they're a government, they understand political risk. They understand regulations and how it works. They're not asking for all the belts and braces. They're not asking for sovereign guarantees, letters of support, everything that we can't give. So this is where I see we're going.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, that's where the money is. And we need a lot of money for the clean energy transition, and a lot of the Gulf economies and the sovereign wealth funds are going to be putting money into clean energy, as well as dramatically growing oil and gas production. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are doing that too, because they see a world where demand is not falling anytime soon, but growth in clean energy is taking off. Huge resources there, huge low-cost renewable resources. I was just in Saudi a few weeks ago, but tremendous revenue needs, right? And you're seeing how hard they're working to try to keep the oil price up now. The question is whether you can get the same rents, whether you can get the same state revenues from developing these clean energy resources that you can from oil and gas to fund a state with the kind of spending that several of these Gulf economies have. And I think that is uncertain. And that's going to be a real challenge for these economies in the long term. But as I said earlier, in the near to medium term, in a world that's not yet moving away from oil, we're seeing, the Biden administration, and I suspect other administrations will increasingly turn to OPEC, particularly Saudi Arabia, to say we need more of your supply, not less, to keep gasoline prices in check.
Middle Eastern countries are certainly getting into the race as well. The UAE is making massive investments in minerals processing capacity. When you think about oil and gas companies, at their core, they're energy companies. And so they see this transition as well. And actually, oil and gas companies were the ones at the forefront of what we talk about as DLE, direct lithium extraction, which is like the cleaner way to get lithium out of the ground from brines. Exxon actually just invested $100 million in a brine deposit for lithium in Arkansas. They're testing the waters, they're getting back into it, because in the 80s they were the ones really leading this development.
Abby, Jason, Andrew, thank you. I have learned a ton. Conversation to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.